HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents North Korea, What Everyone Needs to Know by Patrick Mceachern. Read by Paul Heitsch. Introduction. On November 28, 2017, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un professed his nuclear deterrent complete. After a year of trading colorful barbs with the American president that dangerously raised the chances of miscalculation and war on the peninsula, as well as significant achievements in North Korea's decades-long nuclear and missile development programs, Kim declared his mission accomplished. Although Kim's pronouncement appears to have been premature, North Korea is on the verge of being able to strike the United States with nuclear weapons. South Korea, Japan, and American troops stationed in both countries have long been in North Korea's crosshairs. But the United States' most important allies in Asia have based their national security on a calculation that the United States would defend them if they were attacked. North Korea's gaining the ability to strike the continental United States with nuclear weapons erodes their confidence that an American president would jeopardize Seattle to help Seoul when the chips are down. North Korea's nuclear advances rattle the basic foundations of security in one of the most militarized, populous, and prosperous corners of the globe. Despite the pessimistic outlook in 2017, diplomacy took a sudden turn in 2018 when North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un offered to talk to his South Korean and American counterparts. Kim Jong-un and American President Donald Trump had been dropping provocative threats of military attacks on each other, as South Korean President Moon Jae-in was welcoming the North Korean Olympic team and senior officials to the Winter Olympics that South Korea hosted in February 2018. In just 4 months after the world had witnessed President Moon welcome the North Koreans to the South Korean Winter Olympics, Moon not only orchestrated another inter-Korean summit in April, but also brokered the first-ever U.S.-North Korea summit to take place in June. The diplomatic whiplash appropriately captured international headlines as journalists rushed to document the rapid changes, but short articles or TV coverage rarely offered substantial opportunity to provide the richer background. The North Korean about-face is naturally perplexing on the surface, as are many of the issues surrounding the seemingly mysterious country. Examining some of the deeper context helps to shed some light on the regime's behavior. North Korea, What Everyone Needs to Know, seeks to demystify North Korea on these contemporary questions and many others. North Korea's foreign policy and the nuclear issue dominate the news coverage of the country, but a deeper dive is needed to explain why the country acts the way it does. This book makes no excuses for the Kim family's political choices, but it attempts to show the context, rationale, and trade-offs of its decisions. North Korea's history, relations with its neighbors and the United States, the peculiarities of its political leadership, and the social and economic context help set the stage for understanding today's opportunities and challenges with respect to this country. As with most issues in international affairs, the best place to begin is with the history. Koreans are an ancient people, but North Korea and South Korea established themselves as separate states only in 1948. Following a bitterly opposed Japanese occupation and colonization of Korea, 1910 to 1945, that ended abruptly with Japan's defeat in World War II, the American and Soviet superpowers divided the Korean Peninsula into 2 zones of influence. 2 competing Korean regimes developed, and each government claimed to be the rightful ruler of the entire Korean Peninsula. North Korea initially had the upper hand in both military and economic areas, and sought to eliminate its rival early in the 1950 to 1953 Korean War. North Korea surely would have succeeded in its war effort within months, if not weeks, had it not been for the United States military intervention. For North Korea, the Americans would, from that point forward, be considered the despised impediment to the unification of their nation under Pyongyang's leadership. North Korea then, as now, considered the United States, not South Korea, its primary enemy and security threat. Nevertheless, the two Korean governments were clearly Cold War rivals. Seoul and Pyongyang both sought international legitimacy to represent the Korean people, and today's contrast between a democratic and prosperous South Korea versus an authoritarian and poor North Korea was not present. North Korea enjoyed better economic growth than South Korea during the first half of the Cold War, and South Korea's own authoritarian government represented a contrast between a left-wing dictatorship in the North and a right-wing one in the South. North Korea worried about the American threat to its security, but it compared itself to South Korea and wanted to come out on top. The end of the Cold War brought stunning changes and even revolution to many of the Soviet satellite states, and it had a lasting impact on the Korean Peninsula. With the Soviet demise, North Korea lost its primary security and economic patron. The country descended into crisis and famine in the 1990s as its rival in the South was demonstrating its clear economic superiority and consolidating its newfound democracy. North Korea's traditional allies in Moscow and Beijing established diplomatic relations with Seoul, which Pyongyang saw as nothing short of betrayal, and South Korea's growing economic fortunes translated into political clout in foreign affairs. However, the Kim regime did not collapse, as some had predicted, in part because it differed from other Soviet satellite states and had for decades built a more independent country. Nevertheless, the political and security relationships on and around the Korean Peninsula changed rapidly after the end of the Cold War, and the changes did not favor North Korea. This period brought the nuclear issue to the fore. Long in the background, North Korea's nuclear ambitions reached an acute crisis in the 1990s when it faced increasingly challenging internal and external environments. North Korea used brinksmanship and diplomacy as the countries around North Korea called on it to denuclearize. The United States and North Korea produced a bilateral nuclear accord called the 1994 Agreed Framework, which, after several years of shaky implementation, ultimately fell apart. The bilateral nuclear negotiating framework gave way in 2003 to a multilateral one involving the two Koreas, the United States, China, Japan, and Russia. The six-party talks tackled the same problems with many of the same carrots and sticks used in the U.S.-North Korea effort, and the six-party talks, like the agreed framework before it, delayed and degraded North Korea's nuclear program, but did not end it. This nuclear negotiating history would help inform the analysis and advocacy surrounding the current round of nuclear diplomacy with Pyongyang. While relations between regional powers are woven into the fabric of the nuclear diplomacy, many other issues intersect in Northeast Asia. China is the largest trading partner for both North Korea and South Korea, but its economic relationship with each is fundamentally different. China trades with South Korea on commercial terms for profit, while it reluctantly continues concessionary terms of trade and aid for North Korea for political ends, including preserving stability on its border. Japan colonized the entire Korean Peninsula from 1910 to 1945, and the governments in Seoul and Pyongyang share a disdain for that experience. Nevertheless, the intervening 7 decades have raised other separate issues with Japan for each Korean government. For example, Japan's urging North Korea to return the Japanese citizens it abducted in the late 1970s and early 1980s continues to animate that bilateral relationship. The United States and South Korea are military allies, facing a shared threat from North Korea, yet issues of Korean identity, human rights, and trade can, at times, complicate the alliance. The complex web of issues among the regional powers helps to provide recent background on stories in the news and to explain the complex calculations being made in each capital. Although states may have interests, leaders make decisions. Consequently, no assessment of North Korea is complete without providing background on the Kim dynasty and the leaders they face across the DMZ in Seoul. The three Kims in North Korea who have ruled the country since its founding, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un, have distinct personalities, ruling styles, and even objectives. In South Korea, the differences between its leaders are even more stark. South Korean conservatives and progressives disagree strongly on the proper approach to North Korea policy. Political leaders and systems do not operate without reference to the people they seek to rule. Social and economic issues in North Korea and South Korea may be in the background in discussions of matters of high politics, but they have a profound effect on the long-term trajectory of the Korean Peninsula. Beyond the contrast between the South Korean economic success and North Korean economic failure, what more can we say about these two systems? What are the everyday lives of Koreans in these two countries like? Put differently, if North Koreans and South Koreans are one people, do individuals in each country live in basically similar or fundamentally different ways? In extreme form, how does the North Korean regime treat its citizens and deal with their basic human rights? After a review of North Korea's history, nuclear development, political leadership, and the regional dynamics and social and economic matters in the two Koreas, we will get an opportunity to leverage this understanding of North Korea's past and present to hazard a guess about its future. Looking ahead is always more difficult than looking back, but all forward-looking assessments are not equal. Informed speculation is inherently better than uninformed speculation, but it means narrowing the scope of uncertainty without making a definitive pronouncement on North Korea's years ahead. Reasonable people will disagree. This book endeavors to arm the listener with an understanding of the basic contours that inform the contemporary policy debates surrounding North Korea. It invites the listener to critically engage the questions facing policymakers and concerned citizens in many countries, and to come up with better alternatives to the important and challenging issues that reverberate well beyond North Korea's borders. 1. Origins and the Korean War. What is Korea's 5,000 years of history? Koreans occasionally refer to their people's 5,000 years of history, a description that reflects a well-placed pride in the long and continuous succession of their nation despite having larger nations around them that assimilated others. Korea has not been a singular political unit for 5,000 years, and it was wiped off the map completely as late as the first half of the 20th century, when Japan annexed the country. Its borders and political divisions have changed, but the Korean people have been around for a long time and have distinguished themselves from those who would become the Chinese and the Japanese in particular. As in much of the world, the earliest archaeological evidence of the presence of people in Korea dates back to the Paleolithic age, when people lived in caves and eked out a basic existence. Between 6,000 and 5,000 BCE, people in Korea started developing tools and pottery. The designs became increasingly sophisticated, and around 2000 BCE showed a marked cultural influence from neighboring China. The inhabitants of the Korean Peninsula started to merge as they shifted from hunting and gathering to agriculture, specifically cultivating rice. These communities became the basis of the Korean race and society. The rise of walled towns gave way to a variety of kingdoms across the peninsula as these societies developed spirituality, coins, law, culture, and hereditary political succession. These communities fought with the Chinese, which became the most important influence on cultural development and foreign affairs. Around the 1st century CE, the ancient kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla emerged in what became known as the Three Kingdoms period. Goguryeo was the largest geographically, taking up the northern part of the Korean Peninsula and extending into modern-day China and Russia. Paekje occupied the southwest corner of the peninsula, and Silla the southeast corner. The three kingdoms allied and fought with one another and the Chinese for hundreds of years. In the late 7th century, the southeastern kingdom of Silla unified the Korean people for the first time under one political organization in the unified Silla dynasty. Unified Silla's authoritarian practices gave way to rebellion and a long decline. Local power brokers, however, retained significant influence in practice because the central government failed to maintain deep control over the country. Unified Silla fell in the early 10th century and was replaced by the Korea dynasty, from which the modern name Korea comes. The Korea dynasty lasted for almost half a millennium, but a generation of fighting with the Mongols and Chinese weakened the regime, and Korea fell to another Korean dynasty, Chosun. The Chosun dynasty ruled Korea from 1392 until the late 19th century, when internal weakness and foreign interference led to Japan's political control and annexation of Korea as part of the Empire of Japan in 1910. Japan ruled Korea as a colony until Japan's defeat in World War II in 1945 ushered in the modern period of two Korean governments on the peninsula. Who ruled Korea before the division of the peninsula in 1945? Prior to the division of the Korean Peninsula in 1945, the Empire of Japan ruled Korea. Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910 and ruled Korea as its colony until Japan's defeat in World War II in 1945. Japan reacted differently than most Asian powers that encountered Western nations and imperialism in the mid-19th century. Japan launched its Meiji Restoration, which rapidly modernized the country and saw the adoption of many Western attributes, including the use of modern military equipment and practices. Japan rose to become a regional power unparalleled by its Asian neighbors, and pursued its imperial ambitions using the model of the Western imperial powers in Korea in the late 19th century. Japan defeated the Chinese in 1894 to 1895 in a war primarily fought over which great power would have influence over Korea. A decade later, Japan's defeat of Russia in a war in 1904 to 1905 solidified Japanese imperial ambitions with respect to Korea. In 1910, Japan eliminated Korea as an independent political entity by forcibly incorporating it into the Japanese Empire. A Korean proverb calls Korea a shrimp among whales. It is a small country surrounded by larger ones. The late 19th and early 20th centuries epitomize how the great powers fought over Korea as an object or prize without reference to the will of the Korean people. The Chosun dynasty's political weakness contributed to the great powers' ability to disregard Korean leaders and the popular will. But the point that the larger powers did not defend Korean interests is a lasting memory that continues to animate Korean national consciousness and foreign and defense policies on both halves of the peninsula today. Japan's industrial investments in Korea, especially in the more mountainous northern half of the peninsula, and its business model created lasting economic legacies for Korea. But colonialism also tremendously distorted Korea's economy to benefit Japan. Koreans widely resent Japan's colonization, which changed its level of brutality after a failed Korean independence movement in 1919 and Japan's march to war in the 1930s. On January 8, 1918, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson gave his 14 Points speech, which included a broad-minded call for self-determination. Individual nations should be able to determine their own political futures and not be subject to the whims of empires, he proclaimed. In the following year, 1919, local Korean resistance to colonialism in line with Wilson's ideal culminated in the March 1 movement demanding independence that swelled into mass protests. Japanese colonial administrators violently suppressed the movement. In the 1920s, Japanese colonial administrators attempted to loosen their repression in some ways to avoid further rebellion, and at the same time expanded its police and intelligence presence to root out Korean political activists before they could repeat something like the March 1 movement. However, in the 1930s, Japanese colonialism grew substantially more brutal as Japan marched toward war and exploited its Korean colony in support of its militaristic goals. Japan's active attempts to repress Korean nationalism, language, and culture rose to new heights in the 1930s. Japan expanded its war with China and a variety of Southeast Asian nations by attacking the United States at the Pearl Harbor military base in December 1941. The ill-fated move reversed Japan's war fortunes within months, which only increased its exploitation of Korean labor, economic outputs, and women. By 1944, Japan had mobilized almost 4 million Koreans to work outside their borders, including in Japan and Manchuria, to populate Japanese factories and mines. As Tokyo conscripted more Japanese men into its military, it used forced foreign labor to fill in the workforce. Imperial Japan also forced foreign women, mainly Koreans and Chinese, to service Japanese soldiers in brothels. Japan's recompense for this human rights violation during the war remains one of the sorest areas of Korea-Japan bilateral relations to this day. Significantly, the Allied forces, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, liberated Korea after Japan's defeat in World War II in August 1945, leading the great powers again to tremendously influence the division of the Korean Peninsula along a Cold War logic. Just as at the end of the Chosun dynasty and transition to Japanese colonialism, Koreans again would have a relatively minor voice in determining the political future of their country in 1945. How did the Soviet Union influence the origins of North Korea? The Soviet Union and the United States were uneasy allies at the end of World War II, brought together by common enemies. After Japan's surrender, the two emerging superpowers split Japan's Korean colony into two spheres of influence, the Soviets exerting influence in the north and the Americans in the south. Moscow and Washington both looked for Koreans who could rule the country and remain loyal to them. In North Korea, a marginal guerrilla leader, Kim Il-sung, traveled to Pyongyang, gained the backing of other Korean leaders in the northern half of the country, and won Moscow's support. Moscow did not handpick Kim Il-sung to lead North Korea without reference to local political calculations. Yet the Korean leader would show himself in the coming decades as one difficult to control. In other words, Kim Il-sung was more than simply Moscow's man in Pyongyang. However, the charismatic military and political leader assuaged the Soviets enough that they supported his rise to power in the 1940s. As the Cold War quickly deepened, the divided Korean Peninsula started to look more permanent even as the Pyongyang-based Korean government and the Seoul-based Korean government each claimed legitimacy over the entire peninsula. The two sides clashed in skirmishes in the late 1940s, and the two regimes formally claimed the establishment of their respective statehoods in virtually simultaneous and competing declarations in 1948. The Republic of Korea, ROK, in Seoul, and Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, in Pyongyang, were born. An intense Korean nationalist, Kim Il-sung lobbied Soviet leader Joseph Stalin for military support and then permission to invade South Korea. Kim wanted to unify the Korean nation under his leadership and had the superior military forces to attempt it. Stalin finally relented and gave Kim his blessing, but also urged Kim to coordinate with the Chinese leader Mao Zedong. Kim Il-sung launched the Korean War on June 25, 1950. It was completely his own initiative. However, great power support had helped to create the conditions for his decision. In subsequent decades, Moscow would contribute to North Korea's economic and political development as a socialist ally. Kim was careful to safeguard his independence from his great power benefactors, while also seeking and receiving their material and political support throughout the Cold War and beyond. How did the United States influence the origins of South Korea? As the Soviets had done in the North, the United States played an instrumental role in the foundation of the ROK. South Korea's first president, Lee Sung-man, had lived most of his life before 1945 in the United States, and he arrived back in Korea after the Japanese surrender on an American military plane. While Lee would soon come to show his deep differences with the United States in a variety of fields, he initially gained power and consolidated it around him based on his position as the leader backed by the American authorities. He was a fervent anti-communist, which was certainly a welcome attribute among the Americans at the time. He built a South Korean government focused on opposing the North Korean government and unifying the Korean nation under his leadership. Critically, the American leadership and Lee helped craft the political institutions of the South Korean government, and Lee was elected the republic's first president in 1948. When North Korea invaded in 1950, South Korea was ill-prepared. Despite heroic and usually lethal efforts by South Korean forces to resist the much better equipped North Korean army, Pyongyang quickly captured Seoul and nearly pushed the South Korean army and small American military presence off the peninsula. American reinforcements stationed in Japan then intervened and changed the course of the war, saving the ROK from becoming a brief footnote in history. Fighting continued until an armistice was signed 3 years later. After the armistice ended the main fighting in the Korean War in 1953, the United States and the ROK signed a mutual defense treaty. The treaty allowed the United States to maintain a permanent military presence in South Korea, which continues to today. The expressed purpose of United States Forces Korea remains to deter and defend against North Korean aggression and uphold the United States treaty commitments to the ROK. The United States also became central to South Korea's early economic development through trade and aid. Who was North Korean leader Kim Il-sung? Kim Il-sung was an uneducated guerrilla fighter who opposed Japanese colonialism and rose to become the founder of North Korea. In the 1930s and 1940s, Kim Il-sung operated out of Manchuria, just north of the Korean Peninsula. He fought the Japanese colonialists on the margins of their power, which may help explain why he evaded capture, but he was significant enough as a frustrating element that the Japanese put a price on his head. He commanded up to 300 fighters, but his regime would later exaggerate his importance in defeating Japanese colonialism. After Japan's surrender in World War II and withdrawal from Korea, Kim Il-sung came to Pyongyang. A charismatic figure, he convinced enough of the disparate group of Koreans on the northern half of the peninsula to support him as one of North Korea's most important early leaders. For the next dozen years, throughout the Korean War and into the 1950s, Kim purged rivals and consolidated power. Other North Korean leaders, including leaders of the pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions, worried about the rising cult of personality that centered all political authority in Kim. They criticized Kim's launching of and conduct during the devastating Korean War, as well as his post-war economic policies. They attempted to oppose him in 1956 and failed. Kim carried out a massive purge, to Soviet and Chinese chagrin. Purges would become a regular feature of Kim Il-sung's rule, as he rewarded loyalists, punished perceived and actual opponents, and set up a system of co-optation and repression characterized by inequality and human rights abuses. In a little over a decade, Kim Il-sung transformed North Korea from a dictatorship in which he was a top official among several important figures to a personalist regime in which he was equated with the regime. Kim Il-sung began to transfer power to his eldest son, Kim Jong-il, in an extra-constitutional move in 1980. He started to withdraw from day-to-day governance duties, but when he died in 1994, he still formally held the top positions in all government, party, and military institutions.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?